You're listening to A Book with Legs, a podcast presented by Smead Capital Management. At Smead Capital Management, we advise investors who fear stock market failure. You can learn more at smeadcap.com or by calling your financial advisor.
Welcome to A Book with Legs podcast. I'm Cole Smead. I'm the Chief Executive Officer and a Portfolio Manager here at Smead Capital Management. At our firm, we are readers and book junkies. It can be said that leaders are readers, and we believe books provide us a great source of information for filtering what is and isn't important for us as investors. Investing is the last great liberal art and the best way to spend a lifetime of learning. This podcast is for readers, thinkers, business-minded people, and investors who want to grow their knowledge from great authors and their writing. Charlie Munger often talks about using multiple mental models and analysis. Our aim for this podcast is to help listeners test Munger's theory in business, markets, and people. Just a quick note, if you enjoy the show, we'd encourage you to go write a review or give us a rating on Apple, Spotify, wherever you consume your podcasts. But let's get going for this episode. We're going to have some fun. We're glad you joined us. We're going to talk about international trade, the flow of goods, and economic development globally. So we will discuss how it impacts economics regionally. Shannon K. O'Neill is joining us to talk about her book, The Globalization Myth, Why Regions Matter. She is the Vice President, Deputy Director of Studies, and the Nelson and David Rockefeller Senior Fellow for Latin America at the Council on Foreign Relations. She is also a Bloomberg opinion columnist. If you're like me and addicted to the Bloomberg terminal, you'll know who she is. She's also on the board of directors of the Tinker Foundation. Shannon was a Fulbright Scholar with her PhD in government from Harvard, MA in international relations from Yale, and a BA from Yale. Shannon also wrote Two Nations Indivisible that was published in 2013. Shannon, thanks for joining me today. Really glad to have you.
It's a real pleasure. Nice to be with you.
So we always ask authors this because it's interesting to always hear the response. But what inspired you to write this particularly? What about the idea of kind of deconstructing the myth of globalization?
In part, I sort of stumbled across some data, and that spurred me to write this. And I was looking at North America, and I was looking at issues involved in North America, looking at energy ties and people ties and security ties, and then also commercial ties between Mexico, the United States, and Canada for some work I was doing. And as I took a deep dive into some of the data, I saw, there's a lot of integration between the three countries. 40% of the trade goes between the three of them. But then when I sort of pulled back the aperture and started looking at comparisons with other parts of the world, other continents, Asia or Europe or the rest of Latin America or Africa, I started looking at those numbers and found that, while North America is pretty tied to each other, there's other places in the world that are more integrated, that are more regionalized, that trade more with each other, invest more with each other. And those differences sort of struck me, and I wanted to figure out, did they matter? And if they did matter, why did it matter? Is that something that might explain economic development or economic competitiveness or other kinds of things that we care about in our globalized world? So that's really what led me down a bit of this path.
So you open in your introduction with Akron, Ohio, and you kind of use that as your picture of some of the change that's taken place. Can you teach our listeners what the Akrons of America were at one point?
Yeah, so I grew up in Akron, Ohio. It's in sort of the middle or northeast part of the state. And you go back to the Akron, Ohio of my parents or my grandparents, the post-war period. It was a booming town. It was, they like to call themselves the rubber capital of the world. At one point, they were making 1 out of every 2 tires that were, put out globally. And it was a really prosperous place. Lots of people came to Akron to work, whether they came to move there or they just came to work, migrating from West Virginia or other places around there. And it was a really, prosperous town. It then started to hit the skids in the 1970s and early 1980s. The tire industry and those industries around it started to face stiff competition from Japanese tire makers and car makers, as well as European ones. Mm-hmm. And by the early 1980s, the last tire came off of an assembly line in Akron, Ohio, and none have been made since. And the big companies that were there, Goodyear and Firestone and Goodrich and General Tire and others that, you might have heard of their names, they were sold off to competitors. And you really see the town hit the skids. And many people hold it up as a place that is, an example of the Rust Belt or, the challenges, a victim of globalization. So that's sort of what I grew up with. And, as I looked into this book, You know what? I argue that that's not actually what happened to Akron. The difficulties Akron faced were very true, and all of that did happen. But I would argue that actually what Akron faced was less being a victim of globalization and really a victim of limited regionalization. So when they started facing competition from the Japanese or the French or the Germans, they didn't really have anyone to turn to. You know, they were on their own. They were trying to become more innovative, become more cost friendly and the like, all on their own, while their Japanese competitors were turning to the rest of Asia or many other countries and outsourcing, and by that, doing that, able to bring their cost structure down. The Europeans were doing the same. They were part of the European community, which is the predecessor of the European Union today. And so, you know, German Continental or French Michelin, they were able to sell throughout all of those countries and really gain economies of scale that those in Akron, Ohio weren't able to do. So part of their challenges was NAFTA was a decade away, and so they weren't able to lower their costs and be more globally competitive. And that's one of the challenges they faced.
So you have a great line in your intro, and I have to read this to quote you. Quote, nostalgia blurs the vision. During the supposed middle-class gold age of the 1950s, 1 in 5 households didn't own a car, and fewer than 1 in 10 had a television. Today, the average home has 2 cars, 3 televisions, and a proliferation of other screens. 9 out of 10 have a computer, 3 out of 4 Americans a smartphone. A middle-class lifestyle that includes former luxury turned basics, air conditioning, washing machines, and dishwashers. Abundance has come in large part from technological breakthroughs, but mass ownership is also the result of supply chains that draw on many different factories and countries to make goods cheaper for all, end quote. I love this. Okay, first off, no one says that. It's just factually true, though. It cuts through to the reality of today. We just did, a few episodes ago, we did a book called Superabundance by Marian Tupy and Gail Pooley. I don't know if you've come across that, but you touch on themes of their book. Why do people and politicians peddle a false nostalgia of the past?
This is a real question, and I think there's lots of answers to it. Right? If you said our time was the best time, then it would be hard to sell yourself, especially if you're in the opposition to
Sure.
to other politicians.
Yeah,
so you need something to kind of fight against. I think the other thing is, and then this is back to one of the hallmarks of this latest round of globalization, which, the title of my book is The Globalization Myth. So I think the way we think about it isn't quite right. But one of the differences this time around compared to globalization episodes or eras of the past is it really is one of supply chains. When you look in the past, people were sending out finished goods. They were sending out the finished product that they made in their country to other countries mostly. And this time around, that's not the case. Most of the trade that goes around the world, 75, 80% of it, are the inputs to finished goods. So the commodities or the components or the parts that go into a finished good. So it's a very different globalization. And I think that gets at why the 1950s or 60s is very different than today is the nature of trade has changed. The other thing that's really different that I think we tend to overlook and politicians tend to overlook because it's not a great story or it's not a reaffirming, comforting story is, when the U.S. was really dominating the global economy in the 50s and 60s, early 70s. In part, it was because so many of our potential competitors or other big economies had really been knocked down, on their back foot because of World War II. Europe was really destroyed and was just, could barely feed itself, much less become an export powerhouse to other nations. The same with Japan and much of Asia had yet to really climb that sort of economic development ladder. So the U.S. economy and U.S. companies were pretty much on their own and able to set the terms of the debate. And what happened in the 70s, 80s, and through to today is, we no longer, and U.S. companies no longer set the terms of the debate here. There's lots of competitors out there. And so you have to be more nimble. You have to be faster. You have to be better. And you can't sit back on your laurels. So I think that's a hard lesson or a hard message for any politician to say is that, you need to step it up here, right? It's not that the others are necessarily behaving badly, though sometimes they are behaving badly, and we can talk about that, right? The rules of the game aren't quite right.
Exactly.
Yep. But part of it is you really need to step up your game because others have done that as well and are doing it very efficiently and innovatively and at affordable prices.
So this is kind of the practicality of the writing in your book that I just really enjoyed. So you point out that the average country in the world, 2 randomly chosen countries on average, are 5,300 miles away. But yet most of trade doesn't go on that far away. Can you teach our audience more about, when you talk about regionalization, what are you talking about in distances that trade usually flows?
Sure. So, we often think of globalization, or at least when you read about it in the news and the like, that there's a sense that, the world is flat. That was a famous title of a book, 10, 15 years ago by
Yep.
Tom Friedman. And this idea that, things flow all over the world, everything's made on the other side of the world. And what you find when you dig into the economic data is that that's not actually the case. We have seen a huge increase in trade. So trade's gone from $2 trillion in 1980 to $22 trillion today. So that's a huge growth. So internationalization has definitely happened. But when companies or money or suppliers or customers go abroad, they don't tend to go to that other side of the world. Sometimes they do. And we have examples of companies that really do source from, 58, 60 different countries and have this huge global footprint. But alongside those better known examples are thousands, tens of thousands of other companies that you and I might not know their name unless they happen to be in our community. But they did go abroad and but they went nearby. And so, if the average distance between two countries is 5,300 miles, the average traded good only travels 3,000 miles. And 3,000 miles is about the distance from New York to Los Angeles. It doesn't get you to Shanghai. It doesn't get you to Berlin. It doesn't get you to, the other side of the world if you're based here in the United States. And I think that's an important understanding here is when you combine that with this globalization of today is one of pieces and parts moving around more than finished goods, you start getting supply chains, but the supply chains you get are much more likely to be regional. So when you're manufacturing something, you're much more likely to turn to suppliers or a customer nearby in a country nearby than you are to decide to go to the other side of the world to get that part, to get that component. And that I think is really important in understanding what's happened to communities all over the world, but particularly U.S. communities who have hit harder times or struggled with internationalization and imports coming in. But it's also important in thinking about what are the solutions? How do you bring good jobs to the United States? How do you think about improving the U.S. economy or other countries thinking about their own economies? This regionalization, the ties to closer by countries, I think is really an important part of both what's happened in the last 40 years, but also the answer for those who want to grow more quickly and in more inclusive ways.
Agree. And you add a really good argument that I think is even more valuable in the post-COVID world. You talk about the time. There's transportation costs, but a factor in cost is always time. How quickly does it take to get to market, to get that input, to your point? We've had George Gilder on. He loves talking about money is time, right? And it's the only way to affect for time is by paying money. How do you look at the time to get products to market? I mean, we think back in the last 2 years of all these ships sitting at port, and that was real money being left on the table when they sat out at port. Don't you think that further enhances this regionalization argument post-COVID?
I definitely think it does. And one is, right, COVID showed us that sometimes you thought it was just going to be 6 weeks and it was going to turn out to be 6 months because of
Correct.
the challenges
Yeah.
of
For
logistics.
appliances and things like that. Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, I'm still waiting on a refrigerator that we're trying to replace. So there's challenges here, right? But so time from that distance is part of it. The other thing is alongside COVID, we've also changed, or at least U.S. consumers, I think, have changed their patience in waiting for goods. Whether it's the Amazon effect or it's other things, is you expect to, get on your computer, click on there, and then within 24, 48 hours, you hope that something actually shows up at your front door. And I mean, it's a marvel, the kind of logistics and the speed at which we can do things. But what that means is that products that are created in factories that are far away, especially if they're lower margin products that you're not going to put on an airplane, you're going to send it on a ship. That 6 weeks that it takes to get across the ocean is really expensive. And, one of my favorite examples in the research I did for the book was the company Zara. So Zara is a fast fashion brand. I'm sure many of you have seen the stores if you haven't gone in and bought things. And it's the biggest fast fashion brand in the world. It sells $500 billion worth of goods every year. It's also the most profitable fast fashion brand in the world. And the way it does this is it produces most of its products, about 85% of its products, not in Asia, but in Europe and around Europe. And so because of that, and this gets us to your time issue, they are able to do it. They use a lot of automation and systems and the like, but they do things in small batches. They get things from design to the storeroom floor much, much more quickly than many of their competitors do who make things in Bangladesh or other parts of Asia. And because of that, they're able to keep their profit margins high because they don't have to discount. Things are much less likely to go out of fashion, even in the fast fashion world. And so I think it's an interesting alternative as we think about, even in the most cutthroat of industries, this regionalization can come to an equilibrium or come to, a profit margin that's better than the ones that, people used to depend on or others depend on that's, from shipping, getting very low cost goods, but that are further away.
To add one more thing on the shipping, because you mentioned something that I had really never thought about, and I think it's because I think we live in a blessed time, and I thank God that we live now versus 100 years ago. Can you explain 70 years ago? Actually, I think technically speaking, it was like 67 years ago when shipping change was still boxes and what took place in price. I think that's just a really interesting story to your point about technology and innovation.
Yeah, well, there's, sort of a fascinating story, and there's a great book out there called The Box, which explains shipping containers and the whole history. So
awesome.
if you like to nerd out on these things, definitely go find that book. Yeah. It's great. But, it's interesting. Before we had shipping containers, and now they're so ubiquitous, you can hardly imagine a time when you didn't have them. But there was a time when we didn't have them. And so you had longshoremen, so people on the docks who would take all of these goods, thousands of different goods, and it, whether it was, produce or furniture or whatever else people wanted to send on boats. And these individuals, mostly men, but these individuals would pack a ship, kind of the way you'd pack your car for vacation. And, I don't know if you have done that recently, but you're putting little things in the corners, and then you have to pull something out, and then you're trying to fill all the space so things don't move around and break along the way. And that's really what overseas transit was like before you had shipping containers. It also had to happen on the dock because everybody would bring their product, and then these individuals would sort of piece it together rather than say at the factory, you fill often a shipping container, and then just that gets onto a truck and it's brought right to the dock, and then it goes straight onto the boat and onto wherever it's headed. And so that was just a transformation in the way things worked. It meant that boats didn't have to spend as much time. Otherwise they'd spend a week, maybe even 2 weeks at the port as they were filling up. So that didn't happen anymore. You get them in and out within, a day or two, or sometimes even hours, depending on the technology that's there. And it really lowered the price. So the ease of shipping things across countries and just the cheapness of it, COVID times aside, of course, but it just transformed the industry and allowed us that abundance that we were, you brought up earlier that we're talking about where, you can buy a washing machine or a dryer or all these sorts of things for hundreds of dollars rather than tens of thousands of dollars, the way you would have before this.
So you also point out, just pragmatically, when companies go abroad, it presents interesting challenges, and these are laughable, obviously, Shannon. But I love your little stories you tell about, like, everyone's heard about KFC and their blender in China, but you point out some other ones, and I think the Electrolux one might be my favorite. So I'd love for you to just kind of it's kind of tongue in cheek, but it's still really fun to think about.
It is. So the background to this is that it's hard to go abroad, right? It's not easy to go to different markets, whether searching for suppliers or searching for customers, and that the difficulties in going abroad tend to grow the further away you go. And so as one of my favorites too is this one where, the Electrolux is a European, appliance brand, and they have vacuums. And so they came to the United States, and just their tagline was "Nothing sucks like Electrolux," which doesn't translate very well in American English, let's say, right? And, there was another one where, in China, no one wanted to drink Pepsi because the translation of their, a choice for a new generation was, drink this and your ancestors will come back from the dead. So there's challenges there. But, to a broader point here versus the funny bloopers that sometimes, PR and marketing campaigns become, is that there is a challenge when you go further away. And one of the studies I used in my research was one by McKinsey, the consulting company, and they surveyed about 600 different companies. And what they found was that when companies went abroad, they internationalized, their profit margins did go up. They found ways, whether they found new customers or they lowered their costs or they found new technology, their profits went up. But the further away they went, then their profit margins started to come back down. And so they found, in fact, they dubbed it the globalization penalty, which was go too far away and your profits go down. So it was sort of a Goldilocks. You need to go a little bit away, but not too far away. And I think these bloopers that you get in marketing are one aspect, but there's other aspects of, building teams across time zones and languages and cultures, or maybe across legal systems or accounting systems. Those kinds of things tend to weigh down companies and those who are trying to build corporations. And I think do explain part why globalization isn't as global as we often think.
Sure. And trees don't grow to the sky either, as you're kind of touching on. So in your book, your regional histories, Shannon, I love your regional histories. I love how you used companies, to talk about some of these regional histories and how the companies grew through the regions changing. You kind of kicked this off in Europe talking about Stuttgart, post World War II. In full disclosure, just so you know, we own stock in Porsche Automobile Holdings, Volkswagen, the Porsche car company that just went public, and BMW. So we really, we love this idea and point of view.
So that's why you had me on the podcast. There you go.
No, it's not. But I love the story you tell of kind of like the pre-World War II and then the post-World War II because this was the industrial base of the Nazi regime, for better or for worse. And yet they kind of rose from the ashes to even today. It is still it's one of the epicenters of the automobile business still, but it's different than it was in the past.
It is. And, Germany's recovery in the post-war period, there's lots of reasons for it. But I would argue that one of the reasons was regionalization. It was that Germany, post-World War II, became part of the European community. You saw lots of diplomats around Europe meeting and trying to find a way so that they didn't end up in another war. And so they signed lots of treaties. They signed first a treaty to share steel and coal, and they signed the Treaty of Rome, which brought together 6 countries where they had a free trade area. So you got rid of tariffs and the like. Later on, they signed other agreements that got rid of regulatory differences, some that brought in one currency for, a good number, the vast majority of the various countries, brought one passport and the like. And so that early story of Germany trying to come back and sort of reestablish itself, part of it was that they then had access to this European community. So they weren't just trying to rebuild cars or vehicles or machinery or other things for Germany, which had been devastated by the war. But they had other countries that they could participate with, and also that they could find customers or find suppliers. And it was from banding together those first 6 countries, and then later grew, and now is 27.
Sure.
It's by banding together that they found economies of scale and specialization, and big enough markets to become profitable, and then to create the jobs and the communities and all of the feedback that comes from economic growth. And I think that really is the story. When you look at Germany and how successful it's been as an exporter, you can't forget that really its strength lay on this regionalization, on the fact that it was the European community that it was set within, and then the European Union later, but that it was set within that really allowed it to be competitive globally.
When you do a really good job of pointing out the benefits like you were just laying out, and yet there's a tussle that goes on back and forth where it's kind of like your end objective, but you don't know how you're going to get there for a lot of these trading partners and this idea of regionalization. And you talked about how countries want to pick and choose, even in the European Union, what they're willing to give up and what they're not.
I mean, this is a challenge. And interestingly, the European story is one of diplomats negotiating with each other and coming up with these compromises. And the European Union has had lots of crises along the way. It's had lots of challenges and still does today. And I can't imagine in the next 10 years it won't face many more. But at least so far, every time that they have hit those moments of truth or of challenge, they have decided to double down on the European Union as an entity. So, in the 1980s, they were hitting the challenge of there were no tariffs, but there were all these regulations. So it was making hard to trade between these different countries, and they had a really long time, really hard time getting rid of these regulations. One of my favorite examples there, just because it talks how difficult it is to get rid of regulations, is they had 25 years there where they were fighting over the definition of jelly and marmalade. What was what? And so how would you regulate each one, right? Sure. So you can imagine the Brits felt very strongly about what marmalade was or wasn't. But anyway, in the 1980s, they decided, you know what, we can't negotiate each of these products because there's thousands of them. We're just going to, form this common market, and we're going to just assume all regulation is the same unless there's some reason, a public health reason or a national security reason or the like. So what that meant is, from when that was put in place, all of a sudden, if you had a car in Germany, you didn't have to test it all again once you went to France. So
Sure.
all these kinds of things went away. And you know what? That hasn't happened between the United States, Mexico, or Canada. We still see a lot of those regulations. So no, there's not tariffs, but a lot of those different regulations and tests and other kind of protocols remain, and it costs businesses a lot of money. So that was a real advantage that Europe has been able to overcome. And largely because they sat down at the negotiating table. It was really led by diplomats.
You have a great stat in that portion of your book. You said, quote, in roughly one generation between 1947 and 1975, incomes grew more than they had in the previous 150 years, end quote. How much of that move in that 28-year period would you ascribe to just kind of a recovery off the low of the end of the World War for Europe versus beginning to allow entrepreneurialism, productivity, and freeing up markets during that time?
So it's both, of course, right? You take the mid to late 40s as a start, and you're right, you've just seen many of these countries devastated by war. You've seen, their economies stop or slow down significantly as people were at the front. But a big part of it was this recovery, and recovery in two ways. One was, sure, just getting back to where they were before, but that happened pretty quickly, actually, within a decade. But then the next couple of decades was, there was new infrastructure built. There are new ways of doing things. This combination of bringing together these countries and their economies, it became, much bigger economies of scales, bigger populations, bigger labor forces, more access to various resources and the like. And so you do see this blossoming and growth. I mean, the other thing you also see, which is interesting during these kind of golden years of Europe, I would say, or that recovery, is that productivity growth among workers was really quick, and it was faster actually than productivity growth in the United States for for workers. So I think that too isn't just about recovering from the devastation of war. That's really about a time of education and other sorts of things, of automation that were coming into the systems there. And really, I would say fundamentally a pillar of all this was the regionalization of Europe, of really tying themselves together commercially and economically.
Well, so prior to the war, one of the toughest things that the United States was grappling with their European allies was this idea of trying to find a fixed currency rate, okay? And you talk about, what that was like post World War II, and, this idea of, Europe trying to integrate with a currency. This is just kind of the same issue recurring for the continent. Can you teach our listeners quickly about the snake as the first currency agreement came to be known and what took place to arrive to get to the euro?
So this was a big challenge, and it was particularly a challenge because the United States had a much more fixed currency. We had the gold standard, and so Europe was trying. Well, first, just to step back for a second, in the immediate aftermath of the post-war, there were all these currencies. There was the franc and the lira and all of these other currencies, but nobody really knew what they were worth, and everybody was a little hesitant to take other people's currencies because it was hard to tell if it was worth anything, given sort of the chaos. So part of the Marshall Plan, which was, this plan where the U.S. sent over billions of dollars helping Europe rebuild itself, part of it was backstopping the various currencies and saying, okay, this is what a lira is worth compared to a franc, compared to, a pound and the like, and let us help you get the flow of money across borders back up and running. So that was part of it. But then as you get moving forward, the U.S. had the gold standard. It had a very strong, the dollar. And European currencies, there was a challenge in this trade. They were part of a European community in terms of commerce, but they had different currencies. And depending on, inflation rates and economic growth and other things, certain, Deutsche Mark would be too strong for the franc, and it would lead to different competitiveness issues or the like. And so that is a challenge. I mean, it's a challenge today, right? You see the U.S. government at times talking about currency manipulation and worried about certain countries holding theirs down. Sometimes it's China, sometimes it's Taiwan, sometimes it's others that we worry about. The same thing was happening in Europe in the 60s and 70s. And so the idea in the 1970s, as inflation was growing, as the oil shock was happening around the world, was to tie these currencies together so they couldn't move so much compared to each other and make it difficult for commercial operations on different sides of the border. So one of them was dubbed the snake. It didn't last too long. Maybe it was the name, but maybe I think it was more the structure. And they were trying to keep the currencies, the differences in the currencies or the fluctuation of the currencies within a certain range so that you didn't see too much movement. And unfortunately, as countries hit economic crises, they just fell out of it and they devalued their currency. So that was a challenge. Later on, they tried some other monetary union and in sort of ways where they tried to expand the band and let people readjust their levels, but that too just didn't work very well. So finally, they come around and they decide, okay, well, one option is we just adopt one currency. So we have the euro. And once we get to that point, then there won't be worries about what the franc and, the mark or whatever are trading because it'll just be one currency. Now, to do that, governments had to commit to, balancing their budgets or making sure their deficits were too big. They had to commit to some things for it all to work. And, some of the biggest challenges to the euro that we've seen in the 21st century have been because of different levels of debt or inflation or deficits and the like, right? Especially in the wake of the 2008, 2009 financial crisis. But overall, the solution that Europe came up with was they were trying to manage differences in currencies was to most of them double down and join in one currency. And while, there have been many naysayers of the euro since the euro started, more than 20 years ago. And, there are still big challenges because, while it's one currency, the fiscal choices of governments are fairly separate. It's been able to last. In fact, it has a few new members in just recent years who have joined in to take the euro as their currency.
You do a great job of explaining how the common market and the European Union rules to standardize things really help companies to be able to grow in the region, scale in the region, do mergers in the region. And you point out, I think Siemens you use as an example in your book, but then you also talk about how big the banks got, obviously, when they were able to merge under the common market. This is kind of part of the story that didn't necessarily go well. It was good for the corporate structure, but as we've kind of now known, it wasn't exactly ideal for the banking structure. As we sit here, Shannon, the ECB is approving its first ever buybacks among banks over the last 3 years, which is just crazy to even think about, that it's the first ever that got approved. So I guess when you look at those mergers that took place in the mid-2000s with a lot of the banks there, why do you think banking regulation was never addressed? I mean, there's still not even a deposit insurance that backs the common market banking, for example. How do you look at what was left out of some of the rule building in the common market?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is sort of common capital markets are still to be done. So they started with goods. And that was a real focus. And that makes sense in the, as we think about the post-war period and the return of economies and commerce and the like, it started with goods. They got to services in some ways. And so those two, you could, if you were an accountant in one place, you could be an accountant somewhere else, or
Sure.
Some of these things begin to happen, lawyers and the like. So you see some of that. General, labor, we see you got to a cross-border labor, so everybody has one passport, so you can go work in other places. Even students, you can take your scholarships from one country to another, and so they started going to these various things. And then finance has been the laggard. You've seen some relaxation there, where, as you were saying, they opened it up where a German bank could buy a French bank, and they did, and you see a lot of mergers and acquisitions and growth there. But I do think that initiative that really had some momentum in the early 2000s was set back a pace by the global financial crisis in 2008,
Sure.
2009. And so everybody put a pause on banking because everybody was worried about where things stood. And Europe has really focused on other things. They spent many years just trying to make sure that the debt of various countries, the Greece or Spain or others, that had, sort of shaky finances there in the years that followed, finding a path back to a European approach to these things, through the ECB, through other parts of the European infrastructure and governing system. It is something that there's a lot of talk about now. Right now in Europe, when you go to Brussels or you talk to folks who are focused on this, it's in some ways looking at European economic competitiveness. They want to know why there aren't so many startups. Why isn't there a Silicon Valley in Europe? How do we become a cloud computing leader? How do we get into quantum computing or AI or these things? How do we create sort of a vibrant venture capital market, which Europe has less of? And some of this are these banking rules, these capital market rules, where you don't have the scale. You have separate ones across France and Germany and other places, rather than have scale across all of the various nations that are participating. So now, any of this stuff is hard to do because, people who they're vested interests. There's those who make a lot of money and are quite happy with the way the system is today. They don't want the rules to change. So I think there's always that pushback. And in the past, the European Union, for various reasons, has been able to overcome them. And so, I think we'll keep watching what happens here. But there are a lot of discussions, I would say, at least in Brussels, on how you might now turn to, more union or European Union around capital markets and the like.
Agreed. So let's pivot to Asia, because I think you do a great job of walking us from kind of Japan and how the Japan model got replicated and replicated and replicated. So could you kind of teach our listeners about what was Japan right after the end of the World War, just like kind of we talked about in Europe, and then what transpired through the evolution of the regionalization of Asia, with what Japan then did in other countries?
So Asia's regionalization is different than Europe's. Europe was led top down by diplomats. Asia's arguably, or I would argue, was led by companies and CEOs. And Japan was the first to start this off. And so, Japan post World War II, it too had been on the wrong side of the war. And so it had been devastated during the war and in the end of the war specifically. It had a U.S. Military government there for a while, and transitioned back. But Japan in the 1950s began to grow quickly again. It began to recover from, the post-war period. It also benefited, interestingly, from the U.S. Support for Korea in the war there, the Korean War. Japan became a back base for the U.S. government and often a place of supplying lots of the industrial equipment and military equipment that the U.S. needed in the Korean War. So Japan quickly came to a point where it had lots of business, but didn't have enough workers. So it started outsourcing to other Asian nations, parts of their supply chains. It started creating supply chains that were international. So it turned initially to, at the time, very poor South Korea and Taiwan and Singapore. And so would send out the labor-intensive parts of, making cars or making electronics or making cameras or other kinds of equipment. These countries then, they gained, economic activity. They gained factories. They learned how to run factories. They gained some technology understanding and sophistication. And they began to climb the sort of socioeconomic level and technological level. They became more sophisticated economies and wealthier economies. And then they turned around and when they needed labor and they started outsourcing to some of their neighbors. So they turned to, Thailand and Vietnam and famously China, as China started opening up in the 1980s and 1990s. And so, governments were part of it. It's not to say that they were totally absent, but it's companies and CEOs that were going out, and then governments would then come along and help them. So, they would say, Japan was going to South Korea, was going to set up, some of their companies were going to set up factories. Well, the Japanese government would come along and through their overseas development assistance would build the port that those companies needed to export back to Japan or out into the world. And so you see sort of this cooperation and complementarity between the government and companies as they created regional supply chains. But it wasn't through free trade agreements. It wasn't through these other diplomatic accords. It was really through searching for commercial opportunity and searching for creating more viable and affordable products for the world.
When you talked about Asia in your book, I think there were times that I felt there was more of a winner-loser game going on, and I want to talk about a couple examples. You mentioned in the chaebols of Korea there were several companies, or I'll call it dynastic companies, that had trouble when they didn't agree with the diplomacy in their own country. And you talk about President Park Chung-hee and what he did to those conglomerates that didn't want to develop in the way that the government wanted in Asia.
That's true. There was a much heavier hand. And, right now in U.S. policy debates, we're talking a lot about the return of industrial policy. And, Asia is a story of industrial policy, to be sure. And so you did have governments here picking winners and losers and deciding that there were certain industries that should be a focus of the private sector and that the government would support them in doing that. And South Korea is a famous example of this. And, the president at the time, these were, not a democracy at the time, president at the time, decided that, South Korea was going to be a leader in shipbuilding, for instance. It did not build ships at the time. And, I think a lot of people at the time sort of scoffed that South Korea, which was, a middle income country at best at the time, was going to become a leader in shipbuilding. But, lo and behold, they invested state resources, supported the companies that were going down that path, helped them, fund research and development and help them create markets and have access to markets, put up some protections so that even though their ships at the time weren't as sophisticated or as affordable, they would have buyers. And today, South Korea is one of the biggest builders of ships. So this is, this was industrial policy, I guess, gone right. There's lots of global examples of industrial policy gone wrong. So not to say it always works. But what you did see in Asia, which I do think is different than Europe or different than North America, is sort of the private sector and government working hand in hand in different ways, but also in ways where regionalization was a big part of the success story.
So back to this idea of winners and losers, China did the same thing, but it was a minimum threshold of technology sharing from foreign companies. In other words, like, hey, we get something out of this if you're going to come to our market through the JVs that they required companies to set up. My question isn't necessarily on what they did. My question is, did this, like, I'll call it a steal of intellectual property as we know it today, did that hurt or help the regionalization? Which is a weird question to ask, I know.
I think it was part and parcel of the regionalization. And if you look at before China, if you look back at, sort of Japan at the time, some of it, there was technological transfer that happened there too, to Taiwan, to South Korea. So the governments there would encourage it in the joint venture. Sometimes the governments would help buy it or help finance it for local companies. Sometimes they would then protect their own and push out others once they started to create, semiconductors or the parts they're in. So you've seen some of this interplay before. China did it at scale in a way that no one else had, partly because of its size and its ambition. But I do think this movement of technology is part of that regionalization story. And what's interesting about the China case, I would say, is that, often here in the United States, we're very focused on intellectual property that U.S. companies have, and whether or not it is secure when it goes to China or whether it's copied or the like. But because Asian companies have actually been the biggest foreign direct investors in China and really have the most at stake there, they are as worried, if not more, or been more affected by China's relationship with foreign intellectual property than perhaps U.S. or European companies have. So the Samsungs and the TSMCs, the Taiwan and South Korea and all of these. They have as many concerns about this, if not more, because they're so much closer embedded and wedded to China. And many of them have brought some of their, very technologically sophisticated products there. So I think this is sort of an overall part of the dynamic, but it hasn't necessarily stopped the regionalization process because of how much that regionalization, that specialization and economies of scale can bring kind of innovative, very affordable products that then are globally competitive. And that's what we've seen time and time again, especially in electronics in Asia, is that these Asian supply chains, this factory Asia that's grown up over the last 40, 50 years, is just second to none around the world in particular products, even those that have, intellectual property at the heart of it.
You talk about how the United States, we sell more intellectual property. I think you talked about like YouTubers and, the culture that we effectively export to the world, which the transportation costs, I would argue, are pretty low. Does China have a big disadvantage moving forward? You point out that they're an ocean away from some of the best markets in the world. And in most cases, they're actually still shipping tangible products what you just mentioned in electronics and other things like that. Do you look at that as a big disadvantage that will kind of increasingly become a big question for them? Is that just time to get to market and cost to get to market?
Well, China has had the distance from the US and European markets, that's for sure. And I think that has been a challenge. I mean, I think the real question as we go forward in the next 10, 20 years is, where are the next growing markets, right? Where are the next billion middle-class consumers going to be? And, the answer is a good portion of them are going to be in Asia. And so actually China has an advantage over the US there, at least, and perhaps,
Sure.
Europe, because that's where the next person who's going to buy the first car and first refrigerator and yet another iPhone or whatever the other product is, So I think they're actually the kind of access to markets and time to market in terms of physical goods maybe moving in China's favor vis-a-vis other, the U.S. or Europe. I think that's part of it. The other thing is China has been very forward-leaning in terms of trying to open up those markets for China. So we see them going out and signing free trade agreements. The Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, is that the RCEP? This brings together a dozen plus countries in Asia and really ties up rules of origin that makes it cheaper to produce between these countries altogether. It brings Japan and South Korea and China all together in an agreement, which is, kind of the first unprecedented in bringing them together. China's also applied to become a member of the CPTPP, sort of the Trans-Pacific Partnership that has evolved over the last few years. So they are pretty cognizant of that and going out and trying to find these markets and give themselves an advantage through free trade agreements and the like. And then arguably, I would just say on the services side, right, the YouTube and the other, China has social media platforms. It has others that it's pretty aggressive in trying to push out there. It has e-commerce platforms. It has its version of Uber and others that they are trying to get out and capture markets as well, particularly in kind of the rest of the world. And so now who's going to win these battles and become, the head ride sharing app or the, social media or these versions and the photo sharing app that everybody wants to use? It's hard to see or hard to know so far, but I would say they're definitely thinking about this and being quite forward leaning with the rest of the world. If I was, Facebook or Google or name your favorite company, I guess it's not Facebook anymore, it's Meta. But as you name these, I wouldn't be sitting back. China has some very sophisticated companies that are looking for global market share as well.
So let's pivot to maybe the most contentious 5-letter word ever used in America, which is NAFTA. Okay? It became law January 1st, 94. I was 10 years old at the time. Can you explain how important you think this agreement was at that time? And then the kind of this follow-on question to that is, why does it have such a bad political rap for the benefits it brought? Is it just an easy dog to kick?
Yes, this is a question. So how important was NAFTA? I would argue NAFTA was very important. NAFTA, I know this isn't the popular view here or the conventional wisdom, but I would argue that NAFTA saved a lot of U.S. advanced manufacturing from moving overseas. Arguably, the reason we have a thriving automotive industry in the U.S. is precisely because of NAFTA. And let me tell you a story of one town. I gave you the town of Akron, but let me tell you a story of Columbus, Indiana, which is about a 5-hour drive from Akron, Ohio. So
Sure.
This is another, medium-sized city in the United States, and it is the home of Cummins Engines. So this was a company that was started between the two world wars. It makes all kinds of engines for cars and trucks and heavy machinery and the like.
Best diesel engines out there. Yep.
Best diesel engines, exactly. Great diesel engines. It thrived in the post-war period, just like tires did in Akron. And then it too hit hard times in the 70s and 80s. It was facing Japanese-made engines that were more fuel efficient and more sort of secure and reliable. It was facing, BMW and Mercedes and others who also made great engines. And Ford and others were looking at their competitors and signing contracts with them. And so it had a really rough 1980s, question about whether it would continue. And I would argue that actually NAFTA saved Cummins engines and saved Columbus, Indiana. So with NAFTA, Cummins was able to put some of its production in Mexico, so lower its costs, so it could win contracts that the Japanese had been beating them out on because they just had lower costs. Because they were producing across Asia there, they had these regional supply chains already set up, so Cummins could follow and have regional supply chains. Cummins also got new markets. 100 million Mexicans and particularly Mexican truckers needed engines, and it became, Cummins could sell to them tariff-free. And in fact, today, if you go to Mexico and you're behind one of those big stinky trucks on one of their highways, it's not Cummins engines that's stinky, it's, other things, but it is probably a Cummins engines because they are the biggest engine supplier in Mexico, coming out of a factory in New York, by the way, that are shipped down there. And so you saw Cummins able to recover and really thrive precisely because of NAFTA. And you look at moving aside from just one company, but looking more broadly, you saw the auto industry recover there and grow significantly in the 10 years after NAFTA was signed. You saw regional integration increase a lot in the 1990s. So where right at the signing of NAFTA, about 40% of trade was between Mexico, the United States, and Canada. That rose to 47, 48%. So almost $1 out of every $2 was being traded within these three countries. So companies and others were making things together. They were buying things from each other. They were selling to each other. And there was a real vibrancy. And you also see it was a number of years where jobs, and particularly manufacturing jobs, increased in all three countries. You saw just a real boom in this in those post-NAFTA years. Now, hit 2001, China's entrance to the WTO, and much of this disappears. You see trade between the three neighbors fall back from 47, 48% to 40%. So you kind of lose that integration. You see whole industries decamp for China and Asia. So textiles and shoes and basic electronics and computer printers and all kinds of things end up leaving. Interestingly, Mexico, in terms of a relative hit, it's hit harder than the United States in terms of the communities that were eroded, the jobs that left. They were really hit hard because they were, in many ways, a closer competitor to China and its factories than U.S. factories. But really, to me, the challenge that the U.S. worker has faced, that U.S.-based manufacturing and companies has faced, it came more from China and what some economists call the China shock, where somewhere between 1 and 2 million jobs left the United States because of China's entrance to the WTO, and less from Mexico and less from NAFTA. And in fact, the sort of careful studies that are done of NAFTA jobs, gained and lost, it's pretty much a wash. Yes, there were more imports from Mexico to the United States. And so if you count that as jobs that would have been done here, there's some losses, but there were more U.S. exports to Mexico. And so those jobs were created because we were selling to Mexico. So overall, it's a wash. And it was really China that I think shook up some of these communities much more than NAFTA.
Let's see, you're making me think of a couple things. I lived in Seattle when the WTO riots happened, when they met there, and that was the oddest thing to see as someone in high school at the time. Let's see, a couple other things you mentioned. When we talked with Amity Schlaze on her book, The Great Society, she argued that we ended up paying auto workers way too much. And we destroyed our own auto industry. And to your point, the trade rules of NAFTA, in some respects, helped save those jobs because we could put them to a worker close by to then have the higher skilled worker in the United States be continuing to add the highest value in that food chain. So I really like your discussion of that. You talked about Everett, Washington. My father-in-law worked there for over 30 years. My brother does business class seats at the Boeing plant at Everett as we speak. So everything you're saying here, I was like, wow, this is great. This is my life. But then you get down to like really tangible things. You talk about the crossing at Tornillo, Guadalupe, Texas. And this just like blew my mind. I mean, it's like we're a modern society, Shannon. We're wicked smart, as they say in Boston. And yet we don't know how to build a road on two sides of a border.
So part of the challenge with NAFTA, and part maybe why it's vilified, is it didn't do enough, right? It's sort of this Goldilocks middle between what happened with Europe and Asia, but not in a good way. So it didn't get into the depth that Europe did, right? We got rid of tariffs, but we didn't get rid of regulation. So, one of the examples I use in the book, which I just find the sort of funny but also infuriating, is if Cheerios are made in a factory in Canada, they can't be sent to the United States. U.S. kids can't eat them because they have to pass through so many sanitary checks and regulations that they just can't come here. Now, to me, I'm sure that Canadian factory is just fine, and I would give my kids those Cheerios, but they're unable to do it, and that is dozens and dozens, hundreds and hundreds of products. Yes, you don't pay a tariff if it goes across the border, but the other kinds of regulations and tests and things that have to be done just make it uneconomical. So you don't get that trade. You don't get the economies of scale. So that's one of the reasons I think we see a challenge to NAFTA is it wasn't able to go as far as the European side. And then on the other side is we see some industries like the auto industry, which really embraced NAFTA and took advantage of the rules of origin, took advantages of the three markets put together to make cars that are innovative, but also cost competitive. And so actually expanded the sales of cars. And interestingly, for those who, think about US jobs and the like, and as we were just talking about with Amity's book, interestingly, there's the same number of auto jobs in the US now as there were right before NAFTA. So it hasn't changed that all that much. They've moved to different parts of the United States. So, I think it's hard for someone from Michigan to blame their colleagues in Alabama or Tennessee. It's easier to blame Mexico for it than, your colleagues in the House of Representatives or in the Senate. So that's part of it. But interestingly, with NAFTA, you saw all sorts of international car companies come to North America to begin to produce here, because if you produced outside, you'd have to pay a tariff if you're from Japan or Germany or France and the like. And most of those actually put up shop in the United States, not in Mexico and not in Canada. So interestingly, for instance, Toyota is, one of the biggest car companies in the United States. Sometimes it rivals GM in terms of sales within North America and the United States. And of the 15 plants that they put in North America, I think latest count, 12 of them were in the United States and 3 were in the
Hebron,
other countries.
Kentucky. Yeah,
exactly.
Right
and a dozen other places too. So interestingly, NAFTA crowded in a lot of investment and a lot of jobs and factories here in the United States that probably wouldn't have come if you didn't have that region and you didn't have the sort of benefits of being within the trade region, of locating within the trade region. So I do understand the difficulties, right? I grew up in Akron, Ohio, and we started talking about that story and how hard it is when the economic vibrancy and the social fabric begin to fray when industries leave town. But I think if we're going to try to fix it, whether it's Washington or CEOs and companies and the like, you have to know why it left. And I don't think it was because of NAFTA in a lot of these places.
Sure. You do a good job of explaining a well-educated, medically trained doctor in Canada can't do anything in the United States, which I think is just even funny to think about. When you mentioned that, I had a college fraternity brother of mine. He was from Penticton, British Columbia. He went to college in the U.S. at Whitman College, and he couldn't go to a federally funded research institute over the summer unless he found a grant from an outside donor because it was federally funded. So again, like with bright minds that can't even do stuff in the country that they're being educated in, it's very funny to think about. Let me pivot because you said something that this speaks to our podcast, Shannon. I love this. I gigged out when you said this. You advocate for a liberal arts education comeback, and almost like you hear you screaming, Shannon, like humanities, like out loud almost. And so my heart leapt. I want you to know that. I really appreciate that. I couldn't agree more. But would love you to explain why you said this in your book.
So it is not just because I did that, right? It's like that was, often you say what you do, but it's for a couple of reasons. One is just the speed of technological change and the growth of quantum, physics and computing, and in particular AI. And we've just seen in the last few months, since I finished the book and finished doing the copy edits, but I'm sure you've tried it. I've tried it. The sort of GPT chat and the kinds of things that can be done here. As we think about what we'll be doing, but especially our kids will be doing, or our grandkids will be doing. So many of the things that can be done today will be done much better and faster and more efficiently by computers. But what can't be done by computers, or will not be done immediately by computers, I think are the things that make us truly human. The imagination and the creativity and the complex problem solving and the relating to people and the entertaining and the problem solving. And a lot of that stuff really depends on more of a liberal arts education. Computers are going to be able to code for sure, but can they do those other kinds of things? Can they write plays? Can they write ones that really touch your soul? Can they engage you in things? Can they bring teams together to solve tough problems? That's where I think it will be harder to find people. So one is for your economic survival, commercial survival, and future careers. I think you need that broader set of skills, right? That's part of it. The other is that I think for all of us, we'll probably change jobs more often than, our parents did or our grandparents. And we already see that, right? We already see the normal tenure is, 5 years, not 25 years and in different jobs. And as you change jobs and as you need different kinds of skills, you need to be able how to learn. And what I think a great liberal arts education does is, it might teach you the history of Russia, or it might teach you, Chaucer or some of these things. I'm not sure that really matters, but it does teach you. Sorry, Chaucer. Sorry to Chaucer there, but it does teach you how to learn. It does teach you how to absorb new things, to think about things in different perspectives, to take different frameworks and apply them in places and in areas or in subjects that you've never approached before.
Sure.
And I think that's going to be our future. And then I guess finally what I would say, and this has nothing to do with U.S. economic competitiveness or the like, but hopefully, we don't spend 24/7, at our desks and working, and there's other parts to life. And there I do think a liberal arts education gives you some thoughts and helps you explore what you might want to fill those other 8 hours of your day with.
Completely agree. As an economics and history double major in college and someone who picks stocks for a living, I just want you to continue to preach on that subject, by the way.
And you read lots of books, so.
And I read lots of books. And by the way, to your point, I think the biggest fallacy is that when you go to school, you're learning to know, and you're not. You're learning to learn. Right? That's the process you're going through. You're teaching yourself how to teach yourself, and therefore you continue to apply that same process throughout your life. Let's see. So Shannon, there's quite a few things that we didn't have time for, but people should read on what you write on demographics, I think is an excellent point in your book, and how the demographics lay out across the world. If for another discussion, another day, maybe when I'm in New York and I can have time to buy you a glass of wine, I'd love to talk later with you about the industrial policy shifting, and are we going back to the military industrial complex and those kind of ideas. But I wanted
that's the next book. So happy to discuss it with you.
Yeah, I think that'd be fun. But so I guess, is there anything from this book that we didn't talk about that you do think needs to be mentioned for our listeners?
I guess where I would just end here, and this is, being very U.S. centric about it all, and we can definitely talk about it from other perspectives. But I guess I would say this. I would say, right now, the globalization of the last 40 years, it is changing. It's been changing for the last decade, and COVID has just accelerated these changes. And there's all sorts of factors. There's automation that we've been talking about. There's demographics. There's climate change. There's, demand from consumers to get things faster and right to their doors. And there's geopolitics. And we haven't really touched on that as much, but obviously we've hinted at it here. The challenges and the suspicions between the U.S. and China, the real challenges and kinetic conflicts that are happening in Russia and the Ukraine and these other places. And so all of these are changing in some ways the globalization of the last 40 years. And to me, these changes, they're moving in different directions, to be sure, but overall they will lead toward more regionalization, fragmentation, but definitely regionalization, because what I do think countries will find outside of a very few industries that will be deemed vital for national security and governments be willing to subsidize indefinitely, you're still going to have to, and outside of that, you're still going to have to make profits and losses. You're still going to have to be competitive. And to do that, no country, not the United States, not China, not Europe even, no country or any country in Europe, no country's going to be able to do this profitably, competitively on their own. So international supply chains are here to stay, but they are going to move around, and they are moving around because of all these factors. And where I do think most of them will land as they move around, or a good portion will land, is in more regionalization. So this isn't just the story of the past 40 years. I think it's the story of the next 10 or 20 to come.
Shannon, your framework for the regionalization of the world, like I said earlier, and I'll highlight again, is so pragmatic and refreshing. You actually had me thinking when I got done with your book, gosh, why don't we have an office in Toronto or as someone that represents our investment firm in Mexico City? So I have been scratching my head on that too, just so you know, and I appreciate you for making me ask that question. You highlight many of what I'll argue are man-made problems. They're not natural. They're just been put up by rules or regulations or laws. Our listeners need to go buy a copy of your book, The Globalization Myth. Shannon, thank you again for joining us. For our listeners, if you enjoyed this podcast, please go out, rate it, review it on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to our show. If you have a great book that you'd like to recommend, I know Shannon mentioned The Box earlier, which I'll probably go get a copy of. Email us at podcast@smeedcap.com. That's podcast@smeedcap.com. You can also send your suggestions to us on Twitter. Our handle is @smeedcap. Thank you for joining us for a Book with Legs podcast. We look forward to the next episode.
Thank you for listening to A Book with Legs, a podcast brought to you by Smeed Capital Management. The material provided in this podcast is for informational use only and should not be construed as investment advice. You can learn more about Smeed Capital Management and its products at smeedcap.com or by calling your financial advisor.